Good evening once again, my dear friends. Welcome again to the second lecture that I'm going to give to you this evening. And today we will continue with what with what I have left off in the first lecture. And in the first lecture, I gave you the four elements of conflict. And today in this second lecture, I will be focusing my attention on the first element of the conflict, which is the who. This refers to the stakeholders, who are the parties and who are the stakeholders in the conflict. And we need to be able to identify and describe these stakeholders so that we'll be able to understand the nature and the movement of this conflict. And allow me to share again my screen. And here, um, I'm going to discuss to you uh, the stakeholders analysis or the who. So we will focus on the who. Sino-sino itong mga tao nito na may kinalaman sa conflict. And we have to understand their nature, we have to understand their motive, and they have to understand their degree of participation in that conflict. And when we say stakeholders, we define the stakeholders as those men and women or groups who are directly or indirectly involved in the conflict and have a significant stake in the outcome. So this refers to not only individual men and women, but this also involves different groups. And all of them, from a different varying degrees, they have a significant stake in the outcome of the conflict. Kasi yung mga tao, hindi naman sila nag-engage sa conflict just for the sake of conflict. They are engaged in a conflict because they have a desired outcome. So it just so happened that in coming up with the desired outcome, they have a different perceptions and they have different goals. That's why all of them are engaged in a particular process of trying to achieve their goal. Okay. Now, ang mga stakeholders ay may iba-iba silang antas. They have different levels. You have the primary stakeholders, you have the secondary stakeholders, and you have the the tertiary stakeholders, or shall we just call them interested stakeholders. So the primary stakeholders are those whose goals are perceived by them as incompatible and who interact directly in pursuit of their respective goals. They are the direct investors in the conflict. So in other words, if we are going to particularly use the illustration, for example, of in Eastern Europe, for example, between Russia and Ukraine, for example. So the country of Russia and the country of Ukraine are the primary stakeholders. So their governments, their leaders, their military leaders are the primary stakeholders in this conflict because they are the direct investors of the conflict. They interact directly with each other in pursuit of their particular respective goals. And unfortunately, they have already digressed. They have already achieved the apex of this contention, and they have already engaged in violent confrontation. Now, the secondary stakeholders are affected directly by the outcome of the conflict, but who do not feel themselves to be directly involved. Kumbaga, itong mga secondary stakeholders, alam nila na madadamay sila or maaapektuhan sila sa magiging outcome ng conflict na to. Pero they feel that they are not part of the conflict. That this is perhaps the reason why they are prevented from participating actively in the conflict. They try to inhibit themselves because they believe that they do not have a direct, they are not a direct party to this, but they still, at the back of their mind, they worry that they might be involved, that they might be affected by the outcome of this conflict. So as the conflict progress, they may become the primary, or the primary may become the secondary. So in other words, hindi naman pala total yung kanilang disengagement, but rather there's a possibility that in the future they can be involved. Kaya nga itong pag tinitingnan natin itong conflict between Russia and Ukraine, they have these different kinds of perceptions, and in fact some people are saying that that this conflict in Russia is a, shall we say, is a surrogate. What's that? Parang ano siya, parang surrogate conflict between the East and the West. Yan, between Russia and Western Europe. That's speaking from a macro point of view, from a macro point of view. So they are engaged in this particular conflict. Kumbaga yung Ukraine parang surrogate ano lang 'yon. Labanan. In other words, Ukraine is the one directly involved in Russia, but behind this is the support of the West. But there are also other littoral states around Ukraine, like for example Poland. You also have the country of Moldova. You have the country of Romania, and all of these are bordering. They are littoral states because they are around the corner, surrounding Russia and Ukraine, and they are afraid that as the conflict mutate, that the conflict might also spill out to the other countries. Like, for example, the country of Moldova is a little bit worried that although she is not a party to this conflict, that probably in the future she might be drawn into this conflict because there is a certain portion in her territory. There's a small portion of her population who are fighting for independence and who are considering themselves part of Russia or consider themselves ethnic Russians. And ito ang sinasabi kong example ng mga secondary stakeholders. They may not be directly involved, but there's a possibility that they might be involved because nga they are interested in the outcome of the conflict. Then you also have the interested stakeholders. They stand to benefit in the outcome of the conflict, whether peaceful or otherwise, and they suffer no direct impact. Ito yung mga bystanders na mga party to a conflict na hindi naman sila masasaktan, hindi sila mai-involve, they will not spend anything, and it will not affect their economic well-being, and yet they stand to benefit from the outcome of the conflict, whether the outcome is peaceful or otherwise. So maybe I will not be sorry again. I will not be giving a particular example to this, and but later on as you go on with your case study, you'll be able to decipher all of this. And when you come up to your case study, I hope that you will do your own readings, you will do your own semi-independent table research about the particular topic given to you. And it needs a lot of diligence on your part to do some reading, because you'll not be able to do any analysis if you do not engage yourself in reading. Okay. Now, criteria for determining the primary stakeholders. Kasi minsan, ang isang conflict is also modeled with many different participants, many different parties. Sometimes, mahihirapan kang ma-identify doon. Paano mo masasabi kung sino ang primary doon at sino yung secondary doon? So there are three criteria that you can use to identify the primary and the secondary stakeholders. So ito yung tinatawag natin na una, functional; second, representativity; third is moral. The first one is functional. This suggests those who are directly involved. Their legitimacy is based on their capacity and ability to perpetuate the conflict. So they are directly involved. So kumbaga parte sila. Sila yung may kakayahan na ipagpatuloy ang ganung klaseng sitwasyon. Then representativity. They represent a large number of people who are directly affected by the conflict. So in other words, they engage in a particular conflict because they know that they are representing a national interest or the interest of a particular group of people. Then, kasi halimbawa, dito sa Pilipinas, gawin natin example yung Moro National Liberation Front or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So, paano nagkakaroon ng legitimacy or pagkakakilanlan ang Moro Islamic Liberation Front? Because they claim to represent the people of Bangsamoro. They claim to represent the Muslim and non-Muslim people or population of Southern Mindanao. Yan. That's an example of representativity. Kaya masasabi mo na they are a primary party to the conflict because they represent a group of people or a sort of a national interests. Then third is the moral authority. They have moral authority and interested in peace. They carry the moral vision for a post-conflict society. Ibig sabihin, ang mga bansa, ang mga country, when they engage in a conflict, they have a vision. Meron silang vision para sa kanilang country. Meron silang vision para sa mundo. At ito ang ipinaglalaban nila. Nagkataon lang na yung kanilang vision, yung kanilang pangitain or pangarap para sa kanilang bansa o kaya pangarap sa kanilang sa mundo ay naiiba doon sa pangarap ng iba. That's why it results to a particular conflict. Yan. So yan po ang ibig sabihin niyan. Okay. So, yan. So, these are the three criteria for determining the primary, these are the criteria for determining the primary stakeholders, the functional representativity and the moral authority. Okay. So, people and relationship. Identify who are the stakeholders. They are hidden or manifest. Which of the stakeholders epitomize the conflict? Pag sinabing epitomize, sino ba talaga sa mga stakeholders na ito ang nagre-represent ng conflict na ito? And third, what is the level of polarization of the conflict? Gaano ba ang distansya ng bawat isa? How polarized is the conflict? Ganun na ba sila kalayo? Gaano sila kalapit? And what is the possibility of coming up with a um, uh, sa mga doon, what is the level of paano ba sila masisingitan? Kumbaga yan ang ibig sabihin ng polarization. Gaano ba kalalim ang kanilang differences? Then fourth is determine the constituencies of the stakeholders. So determine the constituencies of the stakeholders. Then number 5 is assess the relationship between the stakeholders. Ano ba yung mga relationship nila? How are they related to each other? And lastly is, what is happening with gender dynamics? In other words, you have to factor in also how this violent conflict, how this conflict situation is impacting the lives of women. Yan. So the goal or agenda, what are the agenda for peace? What are the agenda for war of these participants to conflict? What does the stakeholder hope to achieve? Ano ba ang gusto nilang mangyari? Kaya halimbawa, kung balikan natin yung example natin about Russia and Ukraine, for example, sabi ng Russia, ang kanilang objective daw is to demilitarize Ukraine and to denazify Ukraine. So yun ang kanilang objective. So yung objective naman ng Ukraine is to defend their national sovereignty or their independence. So yan, ang mga countries at mga tao when they engage in conflict, they have something in mind to achieve. Then, are their goals open or hidden? Ano ba yung goals nila? Is it open or it is hidden? Open ba siya or hidden ba siya? Kasi minsan ang mga goals ng mga country sometimes they declare war. Sorry. Sometimes they declare war and at the same time they have also they state their own objectives, but at the same time they also have some hidden objectives behind their at the back of their mind. Then, are the goals tangible or intangible? Ano ba ang gusto nilang mangyari? Ito ba ay something na nakikita, tangible, practical, or is this something which is ideal? Kasi minsan ang conflict can become intangible. Like for example, uh, you say, we are fighting for independence. But sometimes your methods are so ideal that it cannot be given a particular solution other than engaging in a zero-sum type of conflict or relationship, which is not practical because sometimes some conflicts are not winnable. Remember that when you engage in conflict, um, sometimes your objective to win will be depending on the situation, and it will be depending whether you really want to achieve something, or you want to give up everything. Because when you become inflexible in your objective, the more that the conflict becomes impossible to resolve, and in a practical sense, you are not benefiting from this activity of conflict. So, how are the goals articulated by men and women? So, how are these articulated? Meaning to say, how do they express this goal? Is it in a positive way, in a negative way, or is it in a tangible, intangible way? Is it something that is manifest or hidden, etc.? Okay. Then distinguish the needs and interest. Needs, interest, position. This is the one that I was telling in my first lecture. We need to understand the needs, the interests, and the position. So we have to distinguish the needs, interest, and position. What are their shared needs? Kasi ang tao ay iisa lang naman. We belong to the same human race. We have similar needs. But sometimes the way how we express this need, sometimes wala tayong congruence. Kaya doon nagkakaroon ng problema. Are the parties aware of the things that will satisfy their needs? Alam ba nila ang makakapag-satisfy sa need nilang yon? And are the satisfiers available? Are they available or accessible? Who control the access to satisfiers? What are the overlapping interests? So these are the questions that you need to understand if you want to understand the needs, the interests, and the positions of the parties involved. Tandaan natin na itong mga needs na ito, these are the ones that are located within the inner sanctum of the onion. Then the interests are at the middle. Then the position are the outward. Itong position na ito yung ginagawa natin, ito yung sinasabi natin. Yung interest natin, ito yung pinaniniwalaan natin na makakapag-satisfy ng needs natin. Yung needs natin, yung talaga ang pangangailangan natin. Kaya minsan ang nakikita lang natin yung position o kaya yung interest. Hindi natin nakikita yung need. Hindi natin na-realize na yung need niya pala ay pareho rin ng needs natin. Na hindi kailangan na tayo ay magpatayan, kundi kailangan na magtulungan para maintindihan natin ang ating mga sarili para masatisfy natin yung mga needs natin without resulting to this violent confrontation. Kasi pag may violence na, walang nananalo dyan. Everything will suffer a certain degree of loss. Okay. Then we also have to understand also the power base of the stakeholders. Ano ba ang mga power base ng mga stakeholders nito? Ano ba ang kanilang pinanghahawakan? Saan sila naghumuhugot ng lakas? What are the currencies of their power? Is it their political position? Is it their legitimacy? Is their expert power? Is it informational? Is it their ability to coerce? Is it their material resources that they have? Then what impact does this power assessments of the stakeholders have on their choices of their conflict? Kasi minsan, yung mga proseso, mga pamamaraan ng kanilang pag-engage sa conflict is moderated and influenced by their resources. Kung marami silang resources, probably they will engage in a more sophisticated way in dealing with their enemies, with their opponents. Pag limited naman yung kanilang resources, they will think of alternative ways of dealing with a situation. And you also have to understand how organized are the stakeholders. Are they moving as one, or are there factionalism among them? And what are external or internal alliances do these stakeholders have? Sino yung mga kakampi nila? Sino yung tumutulong sa kanila? Paano sila nagtutulungan? These are the things that also we need to understand in order if we want to understand the nature of the stakeholders. Okay. So, in order to map the stakeholders, para itong mga sinasabi kong ito kanina, para makita natin talaga siya in a particular concrete way, pwede ka rin gumawa ng ganitong klase ng matrix. Halimbawa, you're trying to study a particular stakeholder. Ito nga si letter A. Ano ang agenda ni letter A for peace and conflict? Ano yung kanyang mga needs, ano yung kanyang power base, ano yung kanyang action. So you try to analyze, study, and list them. Then create another matrix for the other one, letter B. Si letter B naman ito. And then later on, you can lay this out in a larger matrix and compare these different factors. So diyan mapag-aaralan mo yung dynamics at characteristics ng mga stakeholders sa conflict na yan. Okay. So the cross-cutting questions for stakeholders analysis. Among the stakeholders, which one are perceived as opposed to factual? Then, have you identified the main stakeholders at all? Are the stakeholders identified a manifestation of the current phase of the conflict? Are there anyone that have been missed because of too much emphasis on this phase? And which stakeholders are rooted in history? And which ones are seen as important in the future? Okay. So ngayon, mapping cross-cutting factors. So ito naman, cross-cutting factors. Halimbawa, ano yun? History, perception, local, national, international phase. Then, identify mo yung mga factors, descriptors nila doon based on this column. Okay, another is yan. So yan po ang mga pamamaraan ng pag-aaral ng stakeholders. So tandaan niyo, take note of those factors that I have discussed with you because you will be using that later on when you will be doing your case study. So thank you for listening to our lecture number 2.